Okay, everyone, let's get started. So as I said at the end of last class, today we'll be starting chapter 2. I was looking at how many days we have left. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. I do want to leave at least some time on test review day for actual test review, though at the current pace I may have to spend the first 20 minutes or so finishing up. So we'll see how far we get today. So chapter 2, actually, before I say that, someone asked about a term that I missed in chapter 1, which is the name Daniel Kahneman. He's the guy who did the work on bias, like that vaccine example, things like loss aversion. He's the person who studied that. He won a Nobel Prize for it. He's mentioned in the book. Good to know his name. So chapter 2 is about the extent to which morality is innate. This is a long-standing debate in philosophy, but since moral psychology is an empirical discipline, it has a lot to say about it. The book begins by noting that prima facie, it looks like kids start moralizing very quickly. Start saying things like, that's not fair, you shouldn't do that, so-and-so is a mean or bad person. So some examples from 4-year-old children are given in the book from a preschool, and I can't help but noting one because it's the same name as my brother. Apparently one kid said, "Nathan farted in my face," and I said, "Yuck, Nathan, he didn't even say excuse me." So there's an example of very early moralizing. So as I say, this is a long-standing debate in the history of philosophy. There are those who have argued that morality is, at least to some extent, innate. But there are others who have argued that no, human nature is intrinsically selfish, and morality comes entirely from the outside. Kids start off kind of mean, kind of nasty, and you have to impart morality to them. Additionally, according to Immanuel Kant, who we've already mentioned, he's the one who is the most famous proponent of deontology, so that the moral framework according to which actions are right or wrong independent of their consequences. You can figure out just through the use of pure reason which types of actions are forbidden and obligatory. But if you accept Kant's picture of morality, it cannot be innate. It cannot be something that kids start off with. And to see why, we're going to draw a distinction between a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. Imperative here means something like do. An imperative means like you should do this. A hypothetical imperative is one that is based on your desires or goals. Hypothetical in the sense of, you should do this if, hypothetically, you care about something. So for example, to take a non-moral example, suppose you want to arrive at the movie theater by 7 p.m. It's perfectly valid for me to say, if you care about getting to the movie theater on time, then you should leave your house by 6:30. If you don't care about it, then there's the word should there wouldn't get any traction. So the way a hypothetical imperative works is exactly that. If you care about this, then you should do X. To take a moral case, I could say something like, if you care about the suffering of other people, then you should not attack people. If you don't care, well, then that particular hypothetical imperative doesn't apply to you. For Kant, a categorical imperative is a duty that applies whether or not you care about it. So the moral duties that Kant thought you could discover through the use of pure reason, in his way of thinking, they're not dependent on what you care about or what you want to do or anything like that. And in fact, and this is something that someone like Aristotle would strongly disagree with, but for Kant, if you do a moral action because you like doing it, or I guess a moral action in scare quotes for him, it doesn't count, actually. You should do the right thing purely because you believe it to be the right thing, not because you enjoy it or because you want to do it. Just because through reason you see or apprehend that this is the right thing to do. So kids can't act for moral reasons if Kant is right. Yes?
So what would Kant say if you did the right thing because you thought it was the right thing, but then you still liked doing it? Like that was a consequence of it.
I guess he would say that the reason you did it should be the first half. If you incidentally enjoy it, I don't think that would cancel it out. I'm not a Kant scholar, but that's what I'd be inclined to say. But as I was saying, for Kant then, kids can't have do things for moral reasons because they are not sophisticated enough yet to apprehend what our duties are through the use of reason. Insofar as they do any seemingly moral things, they're going to kind of do what they like doing or don't like doing. And certain early views in moral psychology were influenced by Kant, or had a certain family resemblance to Kant. So one example that the book mentions is Lawrence Kohlberg. How many of you remember Lawrence Kohlberg from Intro Psychology? The 3 stages, pre-conventional, conventional. So if you ever mention to someone, like someone who has a passing familiarity with psychology, if you mention to them, oh, I'm taking a class on moral psychology, the person they are most likely to mention is Kohlberg. Like whenever I say, oh, I work on moral psychology, it's always, oh, have you heard of Kohlberg? Do you know Kohlberg? Have you heard what Kohlberg did? Just because he's the one who's in the intro texts. So for that reason, we'll talk about him. But as you'll see, in contemporary moral psychology, like the cutting edge stuff, Kohlberg is almost never mentioned. But purely for historical interest, I will do a little review of his theory. So the first reading outside of the textbook is a paper by Kohlberg, where he lays out his view of moral development. So Kohlberg thought there were 3 main levels of moral development that kids, generally speaking, progress through. And then each one breaks down into 2 separate stages. So there's 6 total. So starting at the more zoomed out level, the 3 are pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. So to remember it, focus on the middle one and contrast the other 2 with it. So conventional comes from the word convention. Think like social convention. So this stage has to do with what other people think, with what the kind of societal or group norms are. And then pre means before that, post means after that. So in general, in the pre-conventional stage, these are very young kids, Kohlberg thought generally speaking before the age of 9, kids focus on what the consequences of an action are for them. So if I get punished, it's a bad action. If I get rewarded, it's a good action. And the first stage within this one does focus on punishment. And this suggests that Kohlberg didn't think morality was necessarily innate. Because the first thing you have to do to get kids going on this moral development is punish them for the things they are inclined to do, the bad things. That's how you get morality off the ground for Kohlberg. The next stage within this is called instrumental relativist, which is kind of a fancy, I won't have that on the test, but in this stage, things that satisfy one's own needs are good. So if they result in reward, that's a good action. You're trying to get things that you want. Although also in this stage, you start to get early forms of reciprocity and understanding that, you know, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. I do something nice for you, you do something nice for me. This is where you get the, you know, that's not fair, like you aren't sharing or what have you. So as I mentioned in passing, the conventional stage is about what other people think. So in this level, what's moral is determined by some kind of social group. And in the early part, I'm kind of running out of room, but there's the nice boy / nice girl orientation. So if an action makes other people think you're good, that's the action you're going to do. You're trying to get the approval of others with your moral behavior. So whatever makes most people think you're good, that's what's good. And then, still within the conventional level, there's the law and order stage, or orientation. So you start to get a sense that some people's opinion matter more than others, right? So there are authority figures, there are laws that the society has agreed to, and those enjoy a kind of special status. So now, what is moral is whatever the law or authority figures say is moral. The final level, post-conventional, so you're starting to move past the conventions of your society, especially in the second half of this stage. So in this stage, you start to recognize that laws and social conventions can be wrong. It's possible for a society to think something is right, and for that society to be mistaken. So think of Martin Luther King, right? In the South, the American South, segregation, racism were thought to be good. That was the kind of social convention, if you like, and civil rights leaders said, no, that's bad. Based on principles that we endorse, we think the laws and conventions should change. That's a good example of post-conventional morality. The early part of this is sort of similar to the law and order one, which is the social contract orientation. So it's still the laws that matter, but you say that the laws can be changed for the purpose of social utility, for the purpose of, so this is a kind of utilitarian way of thinking. Not exactly utilitarian, but what matters are how well it makes society work. So if the laws are leading to various problems, okay, maybe we'll change them. But the laws are still ultimately going to be what's right or wrong. And then the final part, which is really the core of the post-conventional level, is the universal ethical principle orientation. So in this stage, you start to endorse abstract moral principles like justice or fairness or the golden rule. And that's what determines what's right or wrong. And if the conventions of society contradict those principles, then society is wrong. Again, think of Martin Luther King as an example. Notice that this one is very similar to Kant's way of thinking, where it's these duties and principles that matter. So for Kohlberg, the most advanced, most sophisticated form of moral development is something like a Kantian way of thinking. And a more utilitarian-ish way of thinking is inferior to a Kantian way of thinking. We'll see later that Joshua Green takes the opposite view, but that's one way to think about how Kohlberg sees this. So the way that Kohlberg arrived at these levels was through doing experiments with kids. He would give them various moral dilemmas. One very famous one is the Heinz dilemma, where you ask them, okay, so-and-so's wife is, Heinz's wife is dying of a disease. He can't afford the treatment. He breaks into a pharmacy to steal the treatment to save his wife. Is that moral, and why? And for Kohlberg, what mattered was not which answer they gave, yes or no. What mattered were the justifications the kids gave. And he found that in general, they tend to move in this orientation, or in this direction, sorry. That as they get older, they're more likely to say, to appeal to abstract principles. At the very beginning, they appeal to, oh, will Heinz get punished or not? And then they move through these stages. Okay, so that's a review of Kohlberg. Any questions about him? Yep.
Do most people make it to the post-conventional stage?
Yes, I think in Kohlberg's work most do, if I remember correctly. He did, or not him, but later authors argued that men were more likely to reach the final stage. So Carol Gilligan criticized Kohlberg's work, arguing that, because Kohlberg only looked at boys. And Gilligan argued that women were more likely to arrive at a stage where what matters is not abstract principles, but social context and relational context. Though that finding is generally not replicated, but I believe it's the case that in Kohlberg's study most arrived at the last stage, although you could Google to double check that. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Sorry, do you mind going over what you said was like a Kohlberg way of thinking versus like the Kant way of thinking?
Oh, so good. So Kant, who we talked about earlier, thought that what mattered were moral principles, moral duties that you could arrive at purely through the use of reason. And of all the stages, that is most similar to the final one. So what this means is for Kohlberg, a Kantian way of thinking is the most sophisticated and the most mature. And something that's more utilitarian, like this one, is less sophisticated. And later we're going to see other authors who disagree with that. But so I won't test you on that for the test, but that's one thing that may set you up to see how other views later are different. Okay, so as I mentioned when I was talking about the punishment stage, if you accept a Kohlbergian view at face value, it doesn't look like morality is innate. It looks like it starts off with, conditioning from the environment, right? Punishing kids for doing the wrong things. This chapter is generally going to side with the view that morality is to some extent innate. But it starts off by clarifying what it means to say that a particular psychological tendency is innate, because there's various ways of misunderstanding what that means. For one thing, it can sometimes be interpreted as meaning that a tendency is unchangeable or fixed by the genes. And almost nothing in psychology is like that. And in the case of morality, that should be pretty obvious. All right? For one thing, even within our own society, there's been change in our moral values over the years. And obviously, as we talked about in prior classes, there are differences between cultures in terms of what moral values they have. So it can't be completely innate. It can't be fixed entirely by the genes. But Tiberius uses a very good phrase, which is, we should think of, if we're going to endorse the view that morality is innate, the sense in which it's innate is the genes provide a rough draft, or first draft, of our moral inclinations. So it's not fixed or hardwired, but our human nature biases us in one particular direction. So the environment can edit it in various ways, our cultural background and other things, but what the genes provide is the first draft. So this means we should reject, this is one of the key terms, we should reject the idea of genetic determinism, both with morality and almost every other psychological tendency. Genetic determinism means that the genes 100% determine a particular trait. And in the case of morality, it's very obvious that that's not the case. Another mistake that we should avoid is the naturalistic fallacy. This comes up a lot in discussions of evolutionary psychology. The naturalistic fallacy is the following inference. X is natural, therefore X is good. Right? So, just because we have a particular tendency that's part of our nature doesn't mean we should endorse it. We may decide upon reflection that some of our tendencies are bad. In fact, I'm quite confident that's the case. Right? There's all kinds of biases and bad tendencies that come naturally to humans, but upon reflection we may decide we don't want to endorse. So beware of the naturalistic fallacy. So this section concludes with saying, calling a tendency innate does not mean it's fixed or unchangeable. It just means it's not something that's learned per se. We start off with it, and it's, as I say, a kind of first draft that can still be edited. And last key term for that section, the term for the view that a particular tendency is innate is nativism. So, if you remember Psych 105 in the debates about language, Chomsky was a nativist about language acquisition and Skinner was not. So to be a nativist about language means you think some of language ability is built in by the genes. If you're a nativist about morality, you think the same thing about morality. Okay, so that's what it means to say that a particular, or that morality is to some extent innate. But okay, is there any evidence for that view? So the book again mentions that kids very early, basically as soon as they can talk, start making moral pronouncements. But at that point, I mean, if they're speaking a language, obviously they've been exposed to quite a bit of socialization. So that's not very strong evidence for the tendency being innate. So psychologists have designed some rather clever experiments for trying to look for moralistic tendencies in babies who can't speak. So obviously you can't ask them what they think about morality. But you can use various proxy measures. The next paper that's in the reading is a shorter one, but it's one of the most famous readings in moral psychology. They looked at, I think the range is 6 to 10-month-olds, so very young babies. And you show them kind of puppet shows where there are helpers and hinderers. So there will be a little puppet or shape that has a goal, like moving up a hill. One shape will kind of help it go up, and the other will try to beat it down, prevent it from achieving its goal. You give the kid a choice of which doll to play with, they choose the nice one, the helper one. They also, if there's a doll that punishes the bad one, that hits the bad doll, they like that one more too. So I have some footage of these experiments. The voices you'll hear in the video are Paul Bloom, and then the graduate student is the author of the paper. So hopefully this helps make it more memorable. Okay, so that's, as I say, the voice in the background is Paul Bloom. He was the third author on the paper, and the graduate student you saw was the first author. So that's some evidence for morality being to some extent innate. Now, someone who rejects moral nativism can still say, well, even those 6 months could be enough for some socialization to have kicked in. But as the book says, the state of the debate now is the burden of proof certainly is more on the anti-nativist side. These results provide some prima facie evidence for moral tendencies being innate. So I also included a New York Times article by Paul Bloom where he summarizes a number of different studies. So I have in the key terms stuff about looking times. Don't worry too much about that. That's just background to how some other baby studies are done. What you can do is look at what babies look at longer to see what their expectations are. So, for example, it's been shown that if you show them simple violations of the laws of physics, like I forget the detail, but like you drop a ball and it goes up instead of down, or you have two balls, you put one down behind, so you have two balls, put a curtain up, put one down, curtain comes down, and one of the balls is missing, they look longer, seeming to show that they're surprised. So when simple math and physics is violated, kids look longer, seeming to indicate surprise. And this paper also says that kids not only have a preference for helpers, but also a preference for ones that punish hinderers. So if there's one that punishes the square, like in that example, they like that one more. Now, the paper also mentions what I'm sure many of you were thinking, which is, wait, what if they just like triangles more than squares? And they randomize that kind of thing to control for preferences like that. What the New York Times article closes with is a discussion of some bad tendencies that babies have. Even though they do have these proto-moral tendencies, they also have kind of proto-bias. They prefer to listen to voices with accents that are similar to them. I forget if the paper mentions this, but they also prefer looking at attractive faces. So the idea of moral impartiality, of treating everyone equally, even people in other groups, that does not seem to be built in by the genes. That's something we have to learn through culture. At least that's what the conclusion Bloom draws from these studies. The book then briefly mentions a debate it's just good to know in general. It's a very famous one between Thomas Hobbes. This is who Calvin and Hobbes is named after, like the Hobbes tiger. But my mom got me this after I defended my PhD, so huge Calvin and Hobbes fan. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Does anyone know the debate between these two gentlemen? Can anyone summarize it in a sentence or two? Yep.
Is it that Rousseau was saying that people are innately good, and you have to protect the goodness against societies like corruption, and Hobbes is about people are innately bad, we have to punish them and teach them to be good?
Exactly, yeah. So Hobbes thinks that people are naturally selfish. He has a very famous quote that life in the state of nature meaning before civilization, like when we're, in the savannah of Africa, before city-states. He says life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. So, innately not good. And Rousseau argued that, no, actually, life in the state of nature is good. It's only once you get city-states that you get conflict and war and various bad things. I have a video that I was going to show about this. It's linked in E-class, you can have a look at it. It's a video from Steven Pinker defending Hobbes' side of the debate. He uses estimates of the rates of violence in hunter-gatherer societies to argue that Hobbes was right. I note beside the video that there are some critics of that, and you can see them in a book by Robert Sapolsky. So that's an interesting debate, something you could potentially use, though it's a little bit maybe more anthropology than psychology, but if you're interested, you can have a look at that video. Okay, so we've had a look at the developmental psychological evidence for morality being to some extent innate. Next, with the time we have left, and this is good because I wanted to at least get started on this, we're going to look at different evolutionary models of how moralistic tendencies may have evolved. So this is looking at the innateness question, not from the perspective of developmental psychology, but evolutionary psychology. But any questions on the developmental studies before I move on to that? Okay. So I'll start off by discussing a paradox. If niceness, morality was innate, it would be somewhat paradoxical that evolution would produce something like that. Because what evolution is about it's about traits that increase one's probability of getting one's genes into the next generation. Not helping some other guy get his genes into the next generation. It's a kind of selfish process, right? Genes which produce traits that benefit the organism increase in frequency over time. That's how evolution works. And yet, not just humans, but some other species do have nice, even sometimes altruistic, like self-sacrificial tendencies. So how could these have evolved? And there are two answers that are probably the most popular today. I'll note in passing a third one that's somewhat controversial, but the two I'm going to discuss are probably the most widely accepted. The first, and the easiest to explain, is kin selection. Kin is an old-fashioned word for family. So evolutionary biologists pointed out that the relatives of an organism share some of their genes. So you share half your genes with your children, half your genes with your siblings, less with more distant relatives. And traits that, or genes that make you more likely to help your relatives can increase in frequency over time through this mechanism. So kin selection means traits that enable you to help your relatives will increase in frequency. So the simplest case is, loving your children, right? Genes that make you more likely to be nice to or self-sacrificial for your children, those are adaptive, right? They make it more likely that you will pass on your genes. And this doesn't mean that anyone is consciously thinking, yes, I love my son Timmy because it will increase my chance of spreading my genes. The point is that evolution builds, or our genes build our emotional tendencies, and the genes that give us the emotions to love our children are more likely to be passed on. That's the right way to think about it. So that's one way in which niceness can get off the ground. Another one, which is the subject of the Trivers paper, is reciprocal altruism. This one evolves under more narrow, constrained conditions, but for the kind of morality that we're going to be talking about in this course, it's probably the more important one. So I'll start with the basic outline, and then I'll see how far I get into the actual paper. Reciprocal altruism works like this. If there's a species where members of the species meet each other again and again, and they are intelligent enough to remember who has helped them, who has not helped them, and crucially, they have the capacity to be unhappy or angry when someone doesn't help them back. In a species like that, reciprocal altruism can evolve. So reciprocal altruism means kind of what I said earlier about kids, right? I scratch your back, you scratch mine. I help you today, like you're having a bad day, like we went for a hunting trip, I killed an antelope and you weren't so lucky. Okay, we'll share today. I know I might have a bad day next week, and then you'll help me. And so in the long run, what looks altruistic at first actually is beneficial for both parties. So the example that Trivers gives is just as a kind of parable, someone's drowning and another member of the species sees him drowning, and if the other guy goes in to help save him, it's pretty likely both will survive, but there's a small chance that the saver dies. But the benefit to the recipient is greater than the cost to the helper. That's advantageous so long as the other person will be likely to reciprocate in the future. So what has to co-evolve with reciprocal altruism is the capacity for cheater detection. Because if there is a species of altruists that evolve, so everyone's kind of nice to other people, if a gene emerges that predisposes an organism to just receive the altruism, but never reciprocate, never help out in return, that guy's going to win, right? He's going to get all the benefits without having to incur any of the costs. So then the altruism gene will go extinct. So altruism has to go along with the ability to go, hey, you didn't help, in return, even though I shared my antelope with you last week. Okay, I'm not helping you anymore, or even I might, be angry with you and damage you. And that is in fact what you see in species in which this exists. So humans are an obvious case. I mean, all of you have lived long enough to know that's a very natural reaction if someone doesn't share back or whatever. But if you look at vampire bats, this is an example that's been studied. So vampire bats live together and they share blood with each other. So if one vampire bat has a bad night, they'll share the blood. But if that vampire bat has a good night and doesn't share, then they'll stop sharing with that one. They can remember, oh, that's the selfish one who doesn't reciprocate. Okay, no more blood for them. I'm just going to move through the paper. So one kind of economic game thought experiment that is used to model how this works is the prisoner's dilemma. Have any of you heard of the prisoner's dilemma? A handful? So this is obviously not the kind of thing that would have happened with the vampire bats, but it's a nice kind of way of thinking about how altruism works. So suppose, and it's a little bit weird because the good action is helping out your fellow bank robber. Maybe pretend you're robbing from some bad place or something if it helps you. But so you and your friend are two robbers, and you rob a bank, and you're arrested for the crime. Now, they have enough evidence to get you on weapons charges, so nothing too serious. But they can't prove that you robbed the bank. So they get you into separate rooms, and they say, okay, if you could, actually I'll put up the PowerPoint, I have a picture of this. So here's prisoner A. So both of you are given the offer, okay, confess, that you both did this, and we'll give you a lighter sentence if the other person doesn't confess. So let's take all these different options. So prisoner A, if you don't confess and your partner doesn't confess, so that's the good thing. You're both cooperating. You're both taking a bit of a risk to help out your buddy. We can only get you on 1 year for the weapons charges. But if you confess and your buddy doesn't confess, we'll let you go on parole. So that's what happens to prisoner A. So you get a good deal. And your buddy gets life. So something very bad. If both of you confess, then you both get 20 years. Right? So you don't get any bonus points because the other guy confessed too, so you both get 20 years. And then this one is the mirror image of this one, right? If prisoner B confesses but you don't, so he kind of cheats on you, but you don't, you're not cooperative with him, then you'll get life, and prisoner B will get off easy with parole. So the overall best case scenario, kind of for both considered equally, is this one. You both cooperate. You both don't confess. But the thing is, if you ignore that and just look at, okay, let's assume that the other person doesn't confess. Which is better, for me to also not confess and cooperate, or for me to confess? It's better for me to confess, right? Parole is better than 1 year. And let's say he does confess. He does rat me out. What's better, for me to not confess or for me to confess? Again, it's better for me to confess. 20 years is better than life. So no matter what the other person does, if I'm being selfish, it's better for me to confess. But then what happens is both people do that and both wind up with 20 years. So what's the action that is individually rational is not collectively rational. What this means is, if you're playing a game like this just once, it's better to confess. It's better to cheat on your friend. So it doesn't have to be like a prisoner thing. It could be like, you can even do this as a game. I remember doing a game like this in my moral psych class, where you cheat or don't, and you either get more points or less points. And if you're just playing with the other person once, the rational thing is to cheat on it. But if you play the game over and over again, then it's rational to cooperate, to not confess with your partner. So you can do it like this, right, where you get a certain number of points if you cooperate and a certain number of points if you defect, depending on what the other person does. You don't have to memorize this. Here's the kind of practical upshot of this. They set up a computer model of this where they had this game and they had different programs competing with each other. And they had all kinds of fancy different types of programs, and they wanted to see which one would be most advantageous. So they had probabilistic ones, really complicated ones, and they wanted to see who would get the most points in this kind of prisoner's dilemma game. Where again, you don't just play with the other opponent once, you do it over and over again. And the winning strategy was also the simplest. It was called tit for tat. So in this competitive situation where you can cooperate or defect, this is the winning strategy. Just a few lines of code. You always cooperate first. The first instinct of the strategy is to do the nice thing, do the cooperative thing. After that, do whatever the other player did in the previous round. So if I'm nice first, and they defect, okay, now I'm mirroring what they just did. I'm going to defect. So this is like retribution, right? If you defect on me to get a nice payoff and screw me over, okay, now I'm defecting on the next round. So it's retributive. But it's also forgiving. If the player is nice next time, okay, I'll be nice the next time. So this beat out all the other strategies. And this is basically how humans work, based on this kind of reciprocal altruism model. We are, generally speaking, nice as a first instinct, but we are retributive against people who defect on us, but we also have the ability to forgive if they go back to being nice. So I think I can basically wrap up this paper. So in the rest of the paper, Trivers uses this to explain various human tendencies. So he uses it to explain friendship. Friendship is basically a way of getting the benefits of reciprocal altruism, right? You know someone for a long time, you both help each other out. He uses it to explain moralistic aggression. So if someone cheats you, right, you help them and they don't help back, you're going to be unhappy with them and maybe even lash out at them. So, as I said earlier, reciprocal altruism can only be adaptive if that exists. And it's also used to explain things like gratitude, right? If someone is nice to you, gratitude is one way of it's an emotion that's designed to motivate you to reciprocate. And lastly, Trivers, this one part is more speculative, but he says it may relate to our ability to be plastic. Plastic meaning flexible and able to change in response to experience, especially early in life. His idea was, look, humans will find themselves in different sorts of cultures or situations, and you will kind of shape your tendencies in response to what kind of environment you grew up in. If you're in one where people are kind of constantly cheating each other, you're going to be less likely to be a cooperator or be altruistic as a first response. So that's something he speculates about at the end of the paper. Okay, I was hoping to get to the Trivers paper, so I've gotten through what I wanted to say about that. I've gone on for a while now. Any questions about the Trivers paper? Yeah.
In the key terms, there's altruism to kin and altruism to other altruists. Is there
Yeah, good. Okay, so altruism to kin would fall under kin selection. So it's easy to explain how that evolves. Altruism to other altruists basically is reciprocal altruism, right? The way you're set up is, I only want to be nice to people who will be nice back to me. And I'm going to try and figure out who those people are. I guess, yeah, random dispersion of altruism is someone who's altruistic to everyone, and Trivers says that cannot evolve. Because then you'll just be cheated, and the selfish person will always spread their genes more. Okay, we're basically out of time, so we'll pick it up here next time.